NBC Studios, Burbank, California. October 1967. The building looked like a cathedral of light from the outside. Huge white spotlights swept slowly across the evening sky, their beams crossing like silent sentinels above the studio roof. Cars lined the streets. Well-dressed couples stepped onto the sidewalk laughing, fixing coats, clutching tickets. Inside, makeup artists hurried through hallways, stagehands rolled cables across polished floors, and somewhere deep in the building, an orchestra tuned their instruments, each soft note blending into a low, living hum. Thursday night. Live broadcast night. Inside Studio 4, 200 audience members filled the seats, their voices rising and falling in excited waves. Programs fluttered. Cameras rested on their rolling bases like metal animals waiting to wake. The famous curtain stood closed, glowing faintly under blue stage lights. Backstage, Dean Martin sat alone in his dressing room. The mirror bulbs framed his reflection in soft gold. He adjusted his tie slowly, carefully, like a man who had done this ritual 1,000 times yet never treated it lightly. His hair was perfect. His tuxedo fit like a second skin. On the small table beside him sat a half-finished cup of coffee and a folded note from his daughter wishing him luck, even though she knew he never needed it. Outside his door, the studio was alive. Inside, Dean was quiet. A knock came. "Come in," he said. Charlie Morrison, the senior producer, stepped inside. 55 years old, gray at the temples, clipboard tight against his chest. He was sweating, though the room was cold. "Dean," Charlie said, forcing a smile, "we've got a small issue." Dean studied him through the mirror. "If it's about Bob Hope's golf sketch again, I already agreed to the Penguin." Charlie swallowed. "It's not that." Dean turned. "Then what is it?" Charlie hesitated, then flipped his clipboard around. "Row 8, seat 14. There's a man sitting there who wasn't on the audience list." Dean shrugged, as long as he found a seat. Charlie's voice dropped. "Dean, he's in a wheelchair, both legs gone, severe burn scars, face, neck, hands, very noticeable." Dean's expression changed, the easy humor leaving his eyes. "And?" he asked. Charlie shifted his weight. "Some of the crew think maybe it would be better to move him, somewhere the cameras won't catch him. You know how sponsors are, families watching. We don't want to make people uncomfortable." The room went still. Dean rose slowly from his chair. "How old is he?" he asked. "Maybe early 40s. And he bought a ticket." He came through the service entrance. Security assumed he was staff. He didn't argue, just rolled in and sat down. Dean walked past Charlie, opened the door slightly, and looked down the hallway where distant laughter echoed. "What's his name?" Dean asked. "We don't know." Dean closed the door. "He stays," Dean said. "Dean, he stays exactly where he is." Charlie hesitated. "If the camera catches him." "Then America catches him," Dean said quietly. "And if America can't look at one wounded man, then the problem isn't him, it's us." Charlie nodded slowly. "Okay." When Charlie left, Dean did not sit back down. He stood at the mirror, but he wasn't looking at his tie anymore. He was thinking about war. About the boys he had entertained in hospital wards years earlier. About the letters he had received. About the faces he never forgot. At exactly 7:59, the stage manager's voice rang out. 1 minute. The building seemed to inhale. Music swelled. The band struck the opening notes. Applause erupted like a storm as the red light flashed on. Dean Martin stepped onto the stage. The roar of the crowd washed over him. He smiled. He waved. He delivered his opening greeting like he always did, warm, charming, effortless. The orchestra lifted into "Everybody Loves Somebody." The audience swayed. Some sang softly along. From the stage, Dean could see most of the crowd. And then he saw him. Row 8, seat 14. The man sat very straight in his wheelchair. His pant legs lay folded neatly over empty space. His jacket was old but clean. His hands rested calmly in his lap, scarred, unmoving. His face bore the quiet map of fire long past. And he was smiling. Not a strained smile, not a performance smile. A real one. Dean felt something tighten in his chest. The song ended, applause thundered. The show rolled into its first comedy segment. Dean joked, the crowd laughed, Bob Hope joined him. The sketch unfolded exactly as rehearsed. But Dean's eyes kept drifting back. The man never looked away from the stage. He laughed at every joke, applauded at every cue, his eyes shone under the lights. When the first commercial break came, the house lights dimmed. The orchestra softened into background music. Crew members rushed in with clipboards and headsets. Dean stepped toward the edge of the stage and motioned Charlie over. "Find out who he is," Dean said. "We've got 90 seconds. Then move fast." Charlie disappeared into the aisle. Dean stood alone, watching the man from afar. When Charlie returned, he was pale. "His name is Robert Dawson," he said, handing Dean a slip of paper. 42, Vietnam veteran, mine explosion 1965, lost both legs, severe burns, wife died last year, cancer, no children, released from a VA hospital this morning. He told security he just wanted to see the show once. Dean read the note twice. Then he folded it. "Change the rundown," Dean said. Charlie blinked. "Dean, Vicky Carr is cued." "She'll wait." "What are you going to do?" Dean looked back at row 8. "I'm going to do what the show forgot how to do," he said. The stage manager's fingers began to count down. 5, 4, 3, 2. The red light came back on. Dean walked to the microphone. But he didn't joke. He didn't sing. He didn't introduce a guest. He stood very still. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice lower than usual, "tonight I want to take a moment." The audience quieted. "Sometimes someone walks into this room," he continued, "and they remind us why we're really here." His gaze locked onto row 8. "And tonight, someone very special is with us." Cameras began to shift. Dean took one step forward. And everything that came next would change the show forever. The studio did not yet understand that something irreversible had begun. The audience had settled back into their seats expecting another smooth transition, another polished segment, another familiar rhythm in a show that had trained America to feel comfortable. The orchestra waited with instruments resting on knees. Cameramen stood at attention, hands on focus wheels. Technicians watched the meters. And at center stage, beneath the hot white lights, Dean Martin stood without a cue card, without a punchline, without a song, and for the first time that night without a mask. He did not smile. His eyes remained fixed on a single point in the crowd, and the silence that followed his first unfinished sentence did not feel empty. It felt heavy, the kind of silence that presses on ears and makes people straighten in their chairs without knowing why. Dean took a slow breath, one hand still resting on the microphone stand, and when he spoke again, his voice carried something the audience had rarely heard from him before. It carried gravity. "There is a man sitting here tonight," he said gently, "who did not come to laugh at me, and he did not come because he wanted to be on television. He came because he wanted to feel normal for one night. He wanted to sit in a room where people were smiling, where music was playing, where nobody was looking at him like something broken." A subtle movement rippled through the audience as heads turned, people instinctively searching to see who Dean meant, but the cameras had not yet shifted. The control room hesitated, waiting for a clearer cue. Dean's gaze did not waver. "His name," Dean continued, "is Robert Dawson." The director finally raised his hand. "Camera 2, he whispered, "find him." The camera glided across faces, across glittering dresses and dark suits, across curious expressions until it stopped. Row 8, seat 14. The lens tightened. The studio monitor bloomed with the image of a man in a wheelchair who had not expected to be seen. For a fraction of a second, Robert Dawson's smile froze, not because it disappeared, but because it had nowhere to go. His eyes widened. His breathing changed. He did not understand what was happening, only that suddenly, impossibly, the entire studio was looking at him, and far beyond the studio, millions of people were as well. Dean watched him from the stage, and something in Dean's chest cracked open. "Robert," Dean said, his voice steady but no longer protected, would you stand up for us?" The words were out before memory could stop them. The silence that followed was not the polite quiet of a listening audience. It was the sharp, sudden stillness of a room realizing a mistake at the exact moment it had already been made. Dean's face changed. His breath caught. He saw Robert's hands tense against the arms of the chair. He saw the empty space where legs should have been. "Oh," Dean said softly, the word falling from him like something dropped. No, I'm sorry, that was wrong of me. He took one step back from the microphone. Then, without waiting for instruction, without looking toward the control room, without asking permission from anyone, Dean Martin stepped off the stage. There was an audible gasp from the front rows as he jumped down from the low platform and began moving quickly down the aisle, the tails of his tuxedo brushing past knees, his polished shoes striking the floor with a sound far too real for television. Stage managers froze. Cameramen scrambled to pivot. The director half stood from his chair. No one knew whether to follow him or stop him because no one had ever rehearsed for this. Dean did not slow. He reached row 8 in seconds and stopped directly in front of Robert's wheelchair. For one suspended moment, he remained standing, looking down at the man who had unknowingly changed his night. Then Dean bent his knees. And knelt, not on one knee like a performer acknowledging applause, but on both, fully, lowering himself until he was eye level with Robert, until the bright stage lights no longer crowned him, until the famous face was simply a human one, close enough to see the faint trembling at the corners of Robert's mouth, close enough to see the way his breath shuddered as he struggled to keep control. A sound moved through the studio, not quite a gasp anymore, not quite a sob. Dean did not speak immediately. He let the moment exist. He let Robert exist. He let the cameras find them, let the silence carry what words could not. "Robert," Dean said at last, quietly, "I'm told you were in Vietnam." Robert nodded once, his jaw worked, his eyes glistened. "They told me you were hurt there," Dean continued. "They told me you lost your legs, they told me you were burned, they told me you lost your wife." Robert's composure broke like thin glass. Tears spilled without sound, tracing paths through scars that had long ago stopped hurting but had never stopped remembering. Dean felt his own eyes burn. "And yet," Dean said, his voice thickening, "you're sitting here tonight. You came to a comedy show. You're smiling, you're clapping, you're alive, you're still here." Dean reached out and placed his hand gently over Robert's. "I stand on a stage," Dean said. "I sing songs, I tell jokes, people clap for me, they call me talented, they call me lucky, but you," his breath faltered, "you went somewhere I never went, you carried something I never had to carry, and you came back changed in ways I can't pretend to understand." The studio was so silent that the faint whir of a camera motor could be heard. Robert tried to speak, his lips moved, his throat tightened, no sound came. Dean squeezed his hand. "On behalf of myself," Dean said, his voice now openly breaking, "and on behalf of a country that does not say this enough, I want to thank you." Robert bowed his head, his shoulders shook, he covered his face. Dean rose slowly, but he did not move away. He turned, still standing beside the wheelchair, still keeping his hand on Robert's shoulder, and he faced the audience. "Would you all," Dean said, the words carrying, "stand up, please?" There was a hesitation, as if the room needed permission to breathe again. Then one person stood. Then another. Then the entire studio rose to its feet. At first the applause came gently, uncertainly, as though people were afraid of breaking something fragile. Then it grew, it swelled, it became thunder. Hands clapped until palms stung. Voices cried out. Whistles cut through sobs. Some people applauded with tears streaming openly down their faces. Others pressed hands to mouths, eyes fixed on the man in the wheelchair as if trying to memorize him. The ovation did not fade. It did not soften. It continued, minute after minute, wave after wave, until it no longer felt like applause for a television moment, but like something else entirely, something older and deeper, something that belonged to funerals and homecomings and gravesides and long hospital corridors. Robert's head remained bowed. His hands covered his face. His entire body shook as he cried in a way that was not polite and not quiet and not staged. Dean stood beside him, unmoving. In the control room, the director wiped his eyes and spoke without lifting his gaze from the monitor. "All cameras," he said hoarsely. "On them, don't miss this." Across America, living rooms had gone silent. In small towns and big cities, people leaned closer to glowing screens. Some reached for hands beside them. Some pressed fingers to lips. Some wept without fully knowing why, only knowing that something honest was happening in front of them, and that honesty always hurt a little when it arrived. When the applause finally began to slow, it did not end. It settled into a constant murmur like rain. Dean turned back toward Robert, bent slightly, and spoke only to him. "You didn't come here to be seen," he said, but I'm glad you are." Then Dean walked back to the stage. He did not stride. He did not perform. He walked as a man walks when something inside him has been rearranged. When he reached the microphone, he placed one hand on it to steady himself. He tried to speak. His first attempt failed. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "This was planned." A soft, broken sound of laughter moved through the crowd. "But sometimes," Dean continued, "the things that matter most are never on the rundown." He took a breath. "Vicky Carr was supposed to join us right now," he said, glancing backstage. "She's going to forgive me because I'm going to sing a song instead." The orchestra shifted, uncertain. "I want to sing for Robert," Dean said, "and for people like him, and for the ones who didn't come home." The bandleader nodded. The first notes rose, slow and familiar. Dean closed his eyes. "I'll be seeing you," he sang. The words did not float as they usually did. They trembled. They carried weight. They moved through the studio like a shared memory. "I'll be seeing you in all the old familiar places." The camera found Robert again. His hands had fallen to his lap. Tears streamed freely. He did not wipe them away. "I'll find you in the morning sun." The audience did not move. No one coughed. No one whispered. The song filled the room the way prayer does, the way goodbye does. And in that moment, America was not watching a show. It was witnessing something it did not know it had been waiting for. When the final note of Dean's song faded into the air, it did not vanish the way music usually does. It lingered, suspended in the studio like a held breath, as though even sound itself was reluctant to leave what had just happened. For several seconds no one moved, and then, gently at first and then with growing insistence, the applause returned. This time it was not thunderous or explosive. It was steady, continuous, a kind of collective acknowledgement rather than celebration. Dean lowered his head, one hand resting over his heart, not bowing as a performer but standing as a man who had just said something he could never take back. When the lights dimmed for the commercial break, he remained exactly where he was, his shoulders rising and falling slowly, the echo of the orchestra still humming in his ears. The instant the broadcast cut away, the studio erupted into motion, but it was not the usual chaos of stagehands and camera adjustments. People were crying openly. A makeup assistant stood near the wings with both hands covering her mouth. One of the cameramen leaned against his rig, staring at nothing, tears tracking down his face. In the control room, the director removed his headset and set it on the desk as if he needed the world to be quieter, and the producer who had worried about discomfort earlier sat in his chair with his head bowed, rubbing his eyes like a man who had just seen something holy. The show was supposed to move forward, but emotionally, no one in that building was where they had been 5 minutes earlier. Dean stepped away from the microphone and walked slowly off stage. The moment his shoes touched the darker floor beyond the lights, the strength that had carried him there finally wavered. He sat down on a wooden road case just inside the curtain, elbows on his knees, one hand dragging down over his face. Bob Hope came up beside him and sat without a word. Vicky Carr stood nearby, pressing a hand to her chest, unable to speak. No one rushed Dean. No one needed to. The silence around him was not emptiness now. It was respect. "Where is he?" Dean asked after a moment, his voice low. Charlie hesitated. Still in his seat, he wouldn't move. "Bring him back here," Dean said. "Please." Charlie nodded and hurried out. While they waited, Dean stared at the concrete floor, the studio noise muted and distant. For the first time that night, he allowed himself to feel what he had kept contained while the cameras were on. He felt the unfairness of it, the unbearable imbalance between applause and sacrifice, between jokes and graves. He thought of the hospitals, of the men who never came to shows, of the letters he had once signed too quickly. He did not cry loudly. He simply closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, they were red. When the wheelchair finally appeared in the corridor, pushed gently by a stage assistant, conversation around them fell away. Robert sat as he had before, hands folded, posture straight, his face still wet, his eyes searching for Dean as though afraid the man he had just seen might vanish if he looked away. Dean stood at once and went to him, lowering himself again without hesitation, not because the cameras demanded it, but because something in him did. "Robert," he said softly, "can you talk?" Robert nodded. His voice, when it came, was rough and thin, unused to being asked for. I watch you every week," he said. "In the hospital, they roll the television in. It's the only time it doesn't feel like a hospital." Dean swallowed. "Where are you staying now?" The VA in Westwood. They released me this morning. I didn't know where else to go. Dean held his gaze. Do you have anyone, family, friends? Robert shook his head. My wife died last year. We didn't have kids. My parents are gone. It's just me. The words were not dramatic. They were factual. That somehow made them heavier. Dean sat back on his heels, studying the man in front of him, and something like resolve took shape behind his eyes. I'm going to ask you something, he said. You don't have to say yes. Robert waited. Will you come back? Dean asked. Every Thursday, I want you here front row. You don't pay, you don't need permission. You come, you sit, and you let me see you before I go on stage. Robert stared at him, not understanding at first. Why? He asked. Because, Dean said, if I ever forget who the show is really for, you'll remind me. And if you ever forget that you're still part of this world, I'll remind you. Robert's breath caught, his mouth trembled. You'd really want that? Dean nodded once. I'd need that. Robert reached forward, awkwardly at first, then with urgency, wrapping his arms around Dean's shoulders. Dean embraced him without hesitation, pulling him close, holding him as tightly as he would one of his own children. Around them, hardened crewmen turned away to wipe their eyes. No one spoke. The hug said everything. When Dean finally stood, he rested his hand on Robert's shoulder. You're not invisible anymore, he said. Not here, not to me. The show went on that night. It had to. Songs were sung, guests performed, jokes were delivered, but something fundamental had shifted. The laughter had a different sound. The applause carried something beneath it. Dean performed as he always had, but now every time he stepped forward, his eyes drifted to the front rows where Robert had been moved, where he now sat closer, where the space between stage and audience had been narrowed by something real. By the time the broadcast ended, NBC's phone lines were overwhelmed. Operators wrote messages on scraps of paper and handed them off in stacks. Veterans calling, widows calling, mothers calling, men who had never spoken about what they carried calling to say that for the first time they felt seen. Newspapers would run stories the next morning, but the truth was already moving faster than print could follow. Something had happened that night that could not be edited or reframed or explained away. And it did not end. Robert came back the next Thursday. And the next. And the next. Sometimes he arrived early and waited quietly backstage. Sometimes he stayed after the show and spoke with Dean about nothing important at all. The weather, the music, the audience. Sometimes he said nothing and simply sat while Dean prepared, the two men sharing a silence that no longer needed words. For 7 years, Robert occupied that seat. For 7 years, Dean walked past him before every broadcast and placed a hand briefly on his shoulder, not as a gesture for anyone else, but as an anchor for himself. The show aged, the guests changed, America changed. Robert did not. He sat, he watched, he smiled. And Dean never again walked on stage without remembering the cost of standing there. 7 years is a long time on television, but it is a very short time in a human life. Sets are rebuilt, contracts end, audiences drift, songs that once felt permanent slowly become memories. By the spring of 1974, the Dean Martin Show had reached its final weeks, and the atmosphere inside NBC Studio 4 carried a strange mixture of celebration and mourning. There were farewell banners in the hallways, old photographs hung on temporary walls. Crew members who had worked together for nearly a decade lingered longer after rehearsals, knowing that routine itself was about to disappear. Dean felt it too, not simply as the end of a show, but as the end of a chapter that had reshaped him in ways he had never expected when he first stepped onto that stage years before. On the night of the final broadcast, the studio filled early. The audience buzzed with a different energy, softer and heavier, the way people sound when they know they are saying goodbye. Former guests sat among strangers. Old crew members returned just to be in the room one more time. The orchestra tuned with unusual care. And in the front row, in the same place he had occupied for years, Robert Dawson waited quietly, hands folded in his lap, eyes reflecting the lights as they always had. Dean saw him before he saw anyone else. He did not speak to him immediately. He went through wardrobe. He greeted the band. He exchanged words with producers and shook hands with executives who praised numbers and ratings and legacies. But every movement he made carried an awareness of the man sitting beyond the curtain, the man who had turned entertainment into responsibility. When Dean finally approached him backstage, he did not kneel this time. He simply sat beside him. Well, Dean said, forcing a small smile, we made it. Robert nodded, we did. They did not say more. They did not need to. They had shared 7 years of Thursdays, 7 years of glances before the curtain rose, 7 years of quiet acknowledgments no camera ever caught. Whatever words might have existed between them had already been spent. When the show began, it unfolded as a farewell should. Old songs, old jokes, faces from the past. The audience laughed and applauded and wiped their eyes. Dean delivered every moment with the ease of a man who knew his craft and the restraint of a man who knew when craft must step aside. As the final segment approached, as the orchestra settled into the familiar opening notes of the song that had opened so many nights, Dean felt a tightening in his chest that had nothing to do with stage nerves. He sang, "Everybody loves somebody." The words flowed. The audience rose even before the last note faded, applause surging in a standing ovation that seemed determined to fill every corner of the space. Dean bowed his head. He let them applaud. He let them say goodbye. Then he lifted the microphone again. "Before we go," he said, and his voice was steady but changed, "I need to thank someone who never asked to be part of this show, but who became one of the most important parts of it." He turned slightly and pointed. The camera followed. "Front row. Robert." A murmur swept the studio as recognition passed from person to person. Many in that room had seen him there for years. Few knew his name, all knew his presence. "This is Robert Dawson," Dean said. "He has been sitting in that seat for 7 years, and in all that time he taught me more about courage than I learned in all the years before." The audience stood again, as if standing had become instinct. "Robert," Dean continued, "you reminded me what sacrifice actually looks like. You reminded me that laughter only means something when it honors those who paid for it. And every night that I walked past you before stepping onto this stage, I remembered that this was never just a show. It was a chance to see each other." Dean paused, his eyes fixed on Robert. "I thank you," he said, "for every Thursday, for every smile, for every reminder." The applause that followed was not thunderous, it was reverent. When the lights finally went down for the last time and the studio began to empty, Dean did not leave immediately. He waited until the cables were being coiled, until the makeup stations were being dismantled, until the banners were being pulled from the walls. Only then did he walk back out to the audience area. Robert was still there, speaking quietly with a young stagehand, his wheelchair angled toward the stage as if reluctant to turn away from it. Dean placed a hand on his shoulder. "Come on," he said, "let's go." They left together, slowly, side by side, passing through the same doors they had passed through so many nights before. Outside, the spotlights were already dark. The air felt larger, quieter. The building no longer hummed. Something important had ended. But something else had not. Robert lived another 10 years. He did not become famous. He did not write books. He did not seek stages. He lived quietly. He volunteered at the VA. He spoke to newly injured men when nurses asked him to. He went to baseball games. He sat in parks. He watched old television reruns and sometimes smiled when he saw a familiar face in a tuxedo singing a familiar song. In 1984, Robert Dawson died of a heart attack in his sleep. He was 60. The funeral was small. Veterans in simple suits, nurses, a few men from the hospital, no reporters, no cameras, no stage lights. Dean Martin sat in the front row. When it was time to speak, he stood slowly and walked to the lectern. He did not bring notes. He did not perform. He rested his hands on the wood and looked at the closed casket. "Robert was my friend," he said. "Not because he came to my show, but because he showed me something I needed to see. He showed me that heroism doesn't always look like victory. Sometimes it looks like getting up when there's no reason left to get up, smiling when there's nothing left to smile about, choosing to live when life has taken everything." Dean's voice tightened, but he did not stop. "He sat in front of me for 7 years and never once asked for recognition. And yet he gave me more than applause ever could. He gave me perspective. He gave me humility. He gave me the honor of knowing him." Dean stepped back. He did not bow. Years passed. The recording of that night in 1967 remained locked in archives, occasionally resurfacing in retrospectives or late-night specials. And every time it did, something strange happened. Viewers who had never met Robert felt as though they had. Young people who had not lived through that war felt its cost. Letters were written. Comments were left. Tears were shed by people who had not yet been born when that wheelchair first rolled into NBC studios. Because that night was never really about a celebrity. It was about recognition. It was about the simple, radical act of seeing someone who believed they had been forgotten and showing them, in front of the world, that they mattered. Dean Martin did not change television that night. He changed the meaning of the stage. And somewhere in every crowd, there is still a seat like Robert's, occupied by someone who never expected to be noticed. Waiting,